Tonight's story is about a sea that once glittered with sails and gun smoke, with flags that frighten whole empires, and songs that never made it into official histories. It is about men and women who lived on the edge of maps, in wooden worlds that drifted from island to island, chasing fortune and running from the gallows. People would later call it the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean. For some, that phrase brings images of treasure chests and parrots and easy legends. The real story is quieter and stranger. It is the story of poor sailors turning into something like citizens of floating republics, of ports where law arrived only after dark, and of a sea that slowly went from wild to watched. Before we set sail together, a small request. If you enjoy falling asleep to slow stories like this, you can gently tap the subscribe button. It helps this little harbor of history stay alive. And if there is another chapter of the past you would like to hear, you can leave it in the comments below, like a bottled message cast into the tide. Now, you do not need to remember every date or every name of every island. Just let the images drift by, the way waves move under a ship at night. Tonight, the sea is calm. The lanterns on our imaginary deck burn low, and somewhere ahead a black flag is rising on a morning breeze. This is the story of the golden age of Caribbean piracy, how it rose, how it turned, and how quietly it came to an end. Chapter 1. A Sea Between Kingdoms. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Caribbean looked on maps like a blue sheet scattered with gold. The islands were small, many of them just green humps with white lines of sand and dark rings of reef. But to the great powers of Europe, they were more than dots on a chart. They were stepping stones to silver and gold from the American mainland, and to sugar, tobacco, and other crops that would reshape tastes and economies back home. Spain had come first. Spanish galleons carried bullion from Mexico and Peru, sailing in slow, heavy convoys north through the Caribbean, then east and across the Atlantic. To protect them, the Spanish claimed great swathes of sea and land, as if words written in royal decrees could tame water and wind. But maps do not stay still. The English, the French, and the Dutch, watching Spain grow rich, were not content to look on from gray northern shores. They sent their own ships across the ocean. Some came openly as colonists, planting towns and sugar plantations where they could. Others came with a quieter mission, to harass Spanish shipping, cut into Spain's wealth, and test how strong those royal claims really were. To do this, kings and queens invented a useful half-shadow between war and peace. They gave out pieces of paper called letters of marque, official permission slips for captains to attack enemy ships. It was, in theory, legal robbery on behalf of the crown. Those who sailed under such letters were not pirates, but privateers, private men doing violence for public purposes. In practice, the difference depended more on who was reading the paper than on what happened at sea. If a French captain attacked a Spanish treasure ship with a letter from his king, he called himself a patriot. If he attacked an English ship by mistake, or on purpose, the English called him a pirate. The same man could be a hero in one port and a wanted criminal in another. Over time, this confusion created something new. The Caribbean became not only a route for silver and sugar, but a kind of open-air marketplace for plunder. Small islands with sheltered harbors turned into nests for rough wooden ships. Bars and taverns filled with men whose hands were calloused by rope, whose ears rang with cannon smoke, and whose pockets were heavy with coins stamped with foreign kings. In the beginning, most of these men still thought of themselves as servants of some flag or other. But the sea has a way of loosening bonds. When you have spent enough nights on a creaking deck, watched enough storms roll over the horizon, and felt enough captains' whips or merchants' contempt, loyalty to distant monarchs can start to seem thin. Somewhere in that feeling between hunger, hope, and anger, the first real pirates begin to stir. Chapter 2. Port Royal, the noisy harbor. If you could have flown like an unseen bird over the Caribbean in the late 1600s and looked for a place where this restless energy gathered, you would have found Port Royal. It sat on a narrow spit of land in what is now Jamaica, facing a sheltered harbor and the blue Caribbean beyond. In the heat of the day, the place shimmered with dust and flies and bright sunlight. At night, it glowed with lanterns and laughter. Ships crowded the anchorage, Spanish prizes with patched sails, English merchantmen, smaller sloops that could slip in and out of shallow bays, all jostling for room near the town. On the shore, the streets were lined with wooden houses leaning at odd angles, storage sheds, taverns, and brothels. Inside, rum flowed, cards slapped onto tables, dice rolled, and music stumbled along above the murmur of voices in half a dozen languages. Privateers came here to sell their captured goods, to patch their ships, to spend months of danger and days of reckless ease. Tavern keepers weighed coins that had crossed oceans, stamped with the profiles of kings none of them would ever see. Port Royal had a governor, courts, and laws. It was, at least on paper, a respectable English colony. But paper and rum do not mix well. In practice, the town lived off what the sea and its captains brought in, and no one looked too closely at whether each prize had been taken strictly within the rules of war. If the target was Spanish, and if the goods were rich, Port Royal's conscience slept soundly. Here, a certain figure appears again and again, a sailor who once served on a merchant ship, beaten for small mistakes, fed badly, paid less than promised, or a soldier discharged without enough money to live on, with scars and no land, or a planter who has lost his crop to storm or blight and cannot face another year of debt. For men like these, the sight of a privateer ship in the harbor, its crew loud and rich for the moment, is a provocation and an invitation. They find captains willing to sign them on, and soon they are out at sea, learning a new way of life. Sometimes those captains will have letters of marque. Sometimes they will not. The difference matters less with every passing year. Port Royal becomes, in the eyes of Spanish officials, a nest of pirates. In the eyes of English authorities far away in London, it is a useful irritant against Spanish power, as long as things do not go too far. But the edge between useful and dangerous is thin. All it will take is a change in the wind of politics or a single catastrophe to shift the balance. Chapter 3. From privateers to pirates, wars, for most people, are dates in books. For sailors and captains, they're work contracts. When England and Spain, or France and the Dutch, are officially at war, letters of marque bloom like weeds. Suddenly, men who spent peacetime carrying barrels and cloth can make more money, in a single successful cruise than in years of honest trade. The sea fills with ships looking for targets, enemy merchantmen heavy with sugar, slow silver galleons, or smaller coastal vessels easy to dominate. But wars end. Treaties are signed in chilly European palaces by men who have never felt tropical sun on their faces. The ink dries on agreements that redraw borders and promise peace on land and sea. In the Caribbean, nothing changes overnight. The same ships still rock gently at anchor. The same sailors still wake to the same creaks and groans. The same habits of risk and reward still live in their bodies. What does change is the paper. A captain who had a letter of marque one year finds it invalid the next. A port that used to welcome him now frowns, at least officially, if he brings in captured prizes without clear legal cover. The enemies of yesterday are declared friends and allies by rulers who, only months before, encouraged their harassment. For the men at sea, this can feel like betrayal. Some accept the new rules with a shrug and turn back to merchant work or plantation life. Others do not. They have tasted a different way of being at sea. One where they have a share in the decision of whether to fight, where they can vote on where to go next, where cruel officers and brutal conditions can be answered with a knife in the dark. These men begin to say, quietly at first, and then more openly, that if they are to risk their lives, it will be for themselves, not for distant crowns. They stop applying for letters. Their flags change, their targets widen. Now it is not only Spanish ships that have to watch the horizon, but any vessel fat enough and slow enough to be worth the trouble. To the governments who have just signed their peace treaties, this is not a small nuisance. It is a direct challenge. The same men who once served as convenient instruments of war are now unwanted, uncontrolled, and armed. The word pirate starts to appear more often in official letters and pamphlets, heavy with fear and moral outrage. To the men on deck, the difference between what they are now and what they were a year before feels in some ways very small. They still trim the same sails, fire the same guns, curse the same storms. But in another way, it is enormous. They are no longer pretending to belong to any kingdom. They belong, if at all, only to their own thin, creaking piece of wood, and to each other. Chapter 4. A Floating Republic. Life on a pirate ship was not a carnival of chaos, however much later stories like to paint it that way. If anything, survival in such a small, dangerous world required more order, not less. Imagine a deck perhaps not much longer than a modern city bus, maybe a little wider, cluttered with ropes and barrels, cannon and crates. Under the deck, cramped sleeping spaces where hammocks swing close together. The smell is a mix of tar, smoke, salt, sweat, and whatever food is left. Into this tight space, 40 or 80 or 100 men squeeze their lives. If one person hoards food, others go hungry. If one man picks a fight with a pistol in hand, someone may die in a moment of anger. If shares of plunder are unfair or punishments too harsh, the captain may not wake safely in his own cabin. So pirates, out of hard necessity, tend to agree on rules. When a new crew is formed or when a captain is chosen, they often write down a code, articles that spell out who gets what share of any captured goods, how injuries will be compensated, what offenses are forbidden. The punishments can be sharp, but the rules themselves often carry a rough sense of justice. There may be fines for stealing from another crew member and for fighting on board. There may be extra shares for the captain, the quartermaster, and anyone who risks more in battle, such as those in charge of boarding parties or gun crews. There may be promises of compensation for the loss of an arm, a leg, or an eye to be paid out of future prizes. Most importantly, the captain is not a king. In battle, he commands absolutely. Someone has to decide how close to run alongside the enemy, when to fire, whether to pursue or flee. But in everyday matters, his authority can be checked by the crew. They can vote to replace him if they feel he is too cautious, or too reckless, or too greedy. The quartermaster, elected separately, stands as a kind of counterweight. He manages supplies, leads boarding parties, and often speaks for the crew when dealing with the captain. To men who have lived under strict naval discipline, where officers hold near total power, and ordinary sailors can be flogged for minor infractions, this arrangement can feel almost like a new world. On a pirate ship, decisions about where to sail next might be debated openly. Feasts, when there is a food to spare, are shared. Even the smallest cabin boy may receive some tiny slice of the spoils. Of course, this is not a democracy in any modern sense. Enslaved people, if present, rarely share in these rights. Violence and cruelty are never far away. But within the narrow circle of those who are counted as crew, there's a sense of equality that many could not find on land. Perhaps that, as much as money, explains why some sailors, once they have gone pirate, find it hard to go back. Chapter 5. Days and Nights at Sea. We often remember pirates in moments of bright action. A ship racing under full sail, cannons roaring, men swinging from ropes as they cross to board a prize. Most of the time, though, their lives are made up of something much slower. Long days where the horizon does not change. Long nights where the only sound is the slap of waves and the creak of the hull. A typical day on a pirate ship begins early. The sky is still gray when the first watch ends. Men check lines and sails, look for any signs of wear in ropes that cannot be allowed to fail in a storm. Someone cleans the deck where yesterday's work left splinters and stains. Simple food is shared out. Hard biscuit, maybe a little salted meat or dried fruit if supplies are still good. If the winds are favorable, the ship glides along its chosen course. Lookouts scan the sea for tiny flecks of white on the edge of sight. Beneath decks, some men sleep in their hammocks, rocked by the ship's motion. Others mend clothing, patch sails, carve small pieces of wood into pipes or charms. Stories pass the time. Tales of rich prizes taken years ago, of narrow escapes from naval patrols, of cruel captains they once served and deserted. Stories of strange fish seen at night, glowing in the water. Stories of cities in Europe that many of them left long ago and may never see again. Sometimes there is music. A fiddle, if someone has managed to keep one safe from damp and rough handling. A drum made from a barrel and a bit of stretched skin. Voices raised in songs that keep time with the work of hauling on ropes or turning the capstan. The sea itself changes mood more than the men do. There are days when the wind picks up suddenly, clouds pile on the horizon, and orders snap fast from the captain and his officers. Sails must be reefed, loose objects stowed, hatches secured. Rain whips across the deck, soaking everyone in minutes. Lightning flickers on distant waves. In such moments, the difference between pirate and navy man vanishes. Wood and canvas care nothing for politics. A mast will break as easily under a black flag as under any royal standard. Then there are days of calm, when the wind dies almost completely. The sea turns to a slow, oily swell. Sails hang, barely stirring. The ship makes only the smallest, grudging progress. Heat builds on deck. Men seek shade where they can, bodies moving more slowly, tempers growing irritable. Water always is watched. Every barrel is counted and recounted, every drop guarded. A leaky cask, discovered too late, can turn a routine cruise into a quiet emergency. From time to time, land appears. An island rising from the sea like the back of some sleeping animal. The smell of greenery reaches the ship even before details are clear. Birds wheel above it, calling. To the crew, such a sight means three things: fresh water, fresh food, and fresh danger. For many pirates, islands are both home and hazard. On some, they have hidden supplies under loose stones or in caves. On others, they have friends or enemies among the people who live there. Some coves are secret, known only to a few, where a ship can be careened, heeled over on its side to have its hull scraped free of barnacles and weed. But islands can also be traps. Naval ships may patrol near known anchorages. Local governors, eager to prove their loyalty to distant kings, may send soldiers to watch for strangers. A ship that slips too close in search of coconuts and fresh meat may find itself sailing into an ambush. So every landfall is a decision. Is the risk worth the reward? Are the men more in need of water or safety? Does the sky promise calm, or does it hint at storms that could make any delay dangerous? In the slow rhythm of these choices, the months pass. Some cruises end with little to show. A few small prizes, perhaps, barely enough to pay for the food eaten. Others bring sudden, dazzling success. A merchantman heavy with sugar, a ship carrying coins, or cargoes that can be sold for a fortune in friendly ports. Yet whether rich or poor, famous or forgotten, most pirates share this same background music: wind, water, wood, and the endless rolling line where sea meets sky. Chapter 6. Nassau, the Pirate Republic. As Port Royal declined, another harbor rose in its place as the unofficial capital of the pirate world. On the island of New Providence, in the Bahamas, there was a small town named Nassau. It had a good harbor, shallow approaches that could make things difficult for large warships, and a convenient location near the routes taken by Spanish treasure fleets and merchant ships. It also, for a time, had very little effective government. Storms and wars had battered it. Official authorities were thin on the ground. What it did have was something else. A steady trickle of men who had learned how to fight at sea and were no longer interested in fighting for anyone's flag but their own. Nassau became, for a few brief years, a kind of informal pirate republic. Ships flying no recognized national colors came and went. Captains met in smoky taverns to trade goods and information. Crews spent their shares of plunder on food, drink, and whatever small luxuries could be brought in from elsewhere: cloth, tools, instruments. Outsiders sometimes called the men who gathered there the Brethren of the Coast. a loose brotherhood of pirates and privateers who recognized no law but their own agreements. On paper, Nassau still belonged to the British Crown. In reality, it often felt like another world. In this world, a man who had once been a lowly sailor might walk the main street with gold coins in his pocket and a say in where his ship would sail next. A black sailor, escaped from slavery or freed, might find more equality on a pirate vessel than in most towns on the mainland, his share of any prize closer to that of his white shipmates. Women, too, were present, though not in great numbers. Some kept taverns or houses on shore. A very few sailed disguised as men, or openly, becoming legends in their own right in later stories. Among them, names like Anne Bonny and Mary Red would eventually slip into ballads and books, their lives told and retold until the line between truth and embellishment blurred. The life of this rough republic was vivid but not peaceful. Arguments over shares, fights over insults, uneasy alliances between captains with clashing tempers. All of these marked its days as much as laughter and feasting. From the perspective of imperial officials in London, Madrid, and Paris, however, Nassau represented something larger and more alarming. Here was a community that lived largely outside royal control, thriving on the edges of empire, feeding directly on the lifeblood of trade. As long as the great powers were busy fighting each other, such places could be overlooked or quietly used. But as the 18th century advanced, priorities changed. Peace treaties were signed. Trade routes became more valuable. The idea that a small town of runaways could openly defy crowns began to feel intolerable to those who drew lines on maps. Nassau's days as a pirate capital were numbered, though the men drinking in its taverns did not yet know how small that number was. Chapter 7. Names that still echo. In stories about the golden age of piracy, a few names ring louder than others. They are not the only pirates who prowled the Caribbean, nor always the most successful, but they are the ones whose faces, real or imagined, have stuck to the inside of our collective mind. There is Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. By the time he appears in the records, he is already a seasoned sailor. He commands a ship called the Queen Anne's Revenge, bristling with guns, and a crew large enough to intimidate most targets into surrender without a fight. What makes him memorable is not only what he does, but how he chooses to appear. Before battle, he is said to twist slow-burning fuses into his beard and hair, so that little curls of smoke rise around his face. In the dim light of early morning, with cannons ready and drums beating, this gives him the look of a man wreathed in ghostly fire. To his enemies, catching sight of him through a spyglass as his ship bears down on them, the effect is likely more frightening than any number of official proclamations. Yet even Blackbeard, with all his theatrics, spends most of his time in ways not so different from other captains, negotiating with prisoners, arguing with his crew, trying to keep his ship supplied and his options open. There is Calico Jack Rackham, whose nickname comes from the colorful calico clothes he favors instead of the plain outfits of many sailors. He's not primarily known for great victories at sea, but for his companions. Two of his crew, Anne Bonny and Mary Red, are women who, for different reasons, take up life under the black flag. Later, writers will build their stories into almost pure legend, smoothing away complexities. In the surviving fragments of evidence, they appear as people who are angry with the narrow roles their society offered them and who choose, for a while, the dangerous freedom of the pirate deck instead. There is Bartholomew Roberts, sometimes called Black Bart, who operates more off the coast of Africa and in the Atlantic than in the Caribbean, but whose career sums up much of the age: daring, cunning, and brief. And behind these loud names are many quieter ones, captains and crew who never have ballads written about them, who never appear in engravings with dramatic poses, but who still lived the same hard, uncertain life. They took small prizes, sometimes shared with other crews in loose cooperation. They argued over codes. They voted to depose captains or stood by them in bad weather and worse fights. They drank away their shares or saved them to buy a small piece of land somewhere far from the sound of waves. Their fates, like the fates of their more famous peers, tended to cluster around a few endpoints. Some were killed in battle, on stormy decks, or in confused struggles on captured ships. Some accepted offers of royal pardon when they were made, laying down their arms at least for a while. Some were captured, tried, and hanged, their bodies displayed in chains at harbor mouths as warnings to others. Their names, unlike those of Blackbeard or Anne Bonny, did not echo far, but without them, the Golden Age would have been only a few solitary men, not a whole troubled generation. Chapter 8. The net begins to close. No age, golden or otherwise, lasts forever. For a time, pirates and the powers that claimed the Caribbean existed in a kind of uneasy balance. Pirates took what they could. Governors and admirals grumbled, but sometimes quietly benefited. Rival nations used pirates as tools to hurt each other, then condemned them when convenient. Gradually, though, the cost of this arrangement began to outweigh the advantages. As trade grew, the amount of wealth passing through Caribbean waters increased. Merchants complained more loudly about losses. Insurance grew more expensive. Ships began to travel in convoys, guarded by armed escorts. The great powers of Europe, exhausted by long wars, started to see peace and commerce as more profitable than endless conflict. In this new climate, pirates were less useful as tools and more visible as threats. Kings and ministers sent clearer orders to colonial governors. The time for turning a blind eye was over. Treaties included clauses promising joint efforts to suppress piracy. Naval forces were strengthened. Dedicated anti-pirate patrols were formed. Into this changing sea came men like Woodes Rogers. Rogers had once been a privateer himself. Now he arrived in Nassau as a royal governor with a specific mission: to rake the pirate republic and bring the island under firm British control. He brought with him something sharper than cannons, a choice. On one side, a royal pardon for pirates who surrendered within a certain time, promising them forgiveness for past acts and a chance to re-enter legal life. On the other, the threat of relentless pursuit and, if captured, execution. Faced with this, pirate crews split. Some accepted the pardon, handing in their weapons, hoping to settle down as planters, sailors in regular navies, or tradesmen. Others refused, suspicious of promises from the same authorities who had once used and then discarded them. As the months and years went by, Nassau changed. Where once pirate flags had flown openly in the harbor, now British troops built forts and customs houses. Taverns that had catered mostly to crews from lawless ships now saw more red-coated soldiers and fewer men with pistols tucked into their belts. At sea, naval vessels grew more relentless. They chased pirate sloops into shallow bays, blocked off escape routes, and hunted down captains whose names had become symbols in reports and gossip. Each capture sent a signal. When a pirate ship was taken, its officers and sometimes its whole crew might be brought in chains to a colonial port. There, under the watching eyes of townspeople, they would be tried, sentenced, and hanged. Bodies were sometimes left displayed at harbor mouths for days, an unmissable sign that the rules had changed. The effect was cumulative. Each gallows, each skeleton in chains, each story of a former pirate now forced to watch his old comrades die, pressed on the minds of those still at sea. The rewards of piracy had always been high, but so had the risks. Now, with the net tightening and hiding places disappearing, the balance tilted. Some ships simply vanished, never heard from again, swallowed by storms or the quiet decision of their crews to disappear under new names. The golden age of Caribbean piracy did not end with a single battle or decree. It ended with a series of quiet choices and hard corners, until there were too few pirates left to fill the old harbors. Chapter 9. The last sails on the horizon. By the 1720s and 1730s, the Caribbean was changing in ways a pirate of the earlier generation might have found strange. The same turquoise waters still glittered in the sun. The same trade winds still filled the same old routes. But the flags on the ships were more likely to be those of legal merchants or naval vessels than the improvised banners of pirate crews. Ports that had once thrived on the trade of plunder adapted. Some became more respectable, at least on the surface. Warehouses now stored sugar and coffee, indigo and cotton, rather than hastily unloaded loot. Alongside this shift, the official navies of Europe grew stronger and more professional. Ships of the line, with their impressive rows of cannon, were not the main instruments against pirates. They were often too large and unwieldy to chase small sloops into tricky waters. But their presence in the wider Atlantic signaled a new seriousness about control of the seas. Smaller, faster vessels, brigs and sloops armed with a few well-handled guns, did the actual hunting, slipping into coves, cutting off escape, and escorting merchantmen through dangerous stretches. For the last pirates of the old style, these changes could feel like the shrinking of a world. Islands that had once been reliable hiding places now had permanent garrisons. Friendly governors had been replaced by stricter men who understood that their careers depended on making piracy rarer, not easier. Stories of old captains continued to circulate, but often now as warnings rather than invitations. A young sailor, hearing of Blackbeard's fate, might feel less drawn to imitate him when the story ended not in treasure, but in a bloodied body and a head displayed from a mast. And yet, even as the numbers dwindled, the image of the pirate did not fade. If anything, it became sharper as it receded into the past. Writers began to collect anecdotes, some true, some polished, some invented, about the days when the black flag had flown freely. playwrights and later novelists found in these figures a ready-made blend of danger and freedom, tragedy and adventure. By the time someone in a quiet English or French parlor sat down to write a romantic story about a pirate captain, the last real pirates of the Caribbean might already have been dead for years, their bones resting in unmarked graves on far islands or sunken silt at the bottoms of quiet bays. The sea, as always, rolled on. Chapter 10. From fear to legend. Standing at the rail of a merchant ship in the early 1700s and seeing a black flag rise on the horizon would have been a moment of real fear. Your throat might go dry. Voices would sharpen. Orders would ring out. There would be the rush to prepare weapons, the quick, silent prayers, the glances at the captain to judge his resolve. For those who lived that reality, pirates were not symbols of freedom or playful mischief. They were armed men, hungry for loot, sometimes ready to use terror as a tool. But memory softens edges. As the decades passed and the danger receded, the image of the pirate began to change. Chroniclers old enough to remember the worst of the attacks wrote stern tracts about the wickedness of those years and the justice of their suppression. At the same time, others, especially storytellers and those writing for a wider audience, began to emphasize different aspects: the daring, the disregard for stifling social rules, the rough equality on board their ships. In some tales, pirates became almost like folk heroes, men who stole from greedy merchants, who laughed in the face of pompous officials, who shared their spoils with comrades instead of hoarding wealth in palaces. Their cruelty was downplayed, their charm and boldness highlighted. The black flag, once a symbol meant to freeze the blood, turned in children's books and later films into something more like a costume. Parrots and eye patches appeared, exaggerating and codifying a look that probably very few pirates actually wore. Beneath these layers of fiction, the real history still sits quietly. It reminds us that pirates were not separate from the world of their time, but deeply entangled in it. They existed because empires existed. They thrived because wars created opportunities and then left experienced fighters without work. They built their own rough systems of fairness in response to the harsh unfairness of navies and plantations. Their story is not only about adventure, it is also about labor and law, about who gets to claim the sea and who is allowed to live off it. Even the phrase "golden age of piracy" carries that double edge. Golden for whom? For the captains who lived fast and sometimes died well-fed but young. For the sailors who, for a few years, tasted a kind of equality and self-rule rare in their world. Certainly not for the merchants who lost cargoes, or for the enslaved people whose suffering underpinned the wealth that pirates sometimes snatched on its way from one port to another. Yet when we use the word now, we mostly mean something simpler, a time when the stories are thick on the water, when the image of a ship under ragged black sails moving silently through moonlight feels vivid and complete. It is that image, softened and slowed, that we carry with us tonight. Chapter 11. The Sea as a Lullaby. Now, as you lie in the quiet of your own room, the Caribbean is far away. Its waters move under a different sky, in a different time zone, against different coasts than those outside your window. The old ports of Port Royal and Nassau have changed faces many times since the days when pirates walked their streets with easy swagger. But the sound of water against wood, of waves sliding against a hull, is much the same as it was 3 centuries ago. The men who once stood on those decks are gone. Their ships have rotted, sunk, or been broken up for scrap. The flags they flew are preserved only in museums, paintings, and the loose memory of fictional tales. What remains is a curve of history and a mood. The curve is simple to trace. It begins with empires throwing out long, fragile lines across the ocean. Then come the privateers, half-legal predators in the service of crowns. Then, in the spaces between wars appear the pirates, no longer content with borrowed legality. They rise, gather in noisy harbors, build their rough codes, and leave their scars on trade routes and memories. Finally, as governments harden and trade grows more precious, they are hunted down, scattered, and erased from the living sea. The mood is harder to describe, but you might feel it. It is a mixture of wind and risk, of small wooden worlds adrift between islands, of people for whom the line between life and death, poverty and sudden wealth, obscurity and whispered fame could change with the sighting of a distant sail. As you drift toward sleep, you do not need to sort out which parts of the pirate stories you have heard before are true and which are embroidered. You do not need to argue with old historians about exact numbers or dates. You can just let a few images settle gently in your mind. A crowded Jamaican tavern, candles guttering, as men with weathered faces laugh and argue about their next voyage. A ship slipping out of Nassau Harbor before dawn, its hull low in the water from the weight of guns, its crew quiet and alert, sails catching the first breath of morning wind. The pale curve of an empty horizon, watched for hours by a tired lookout. A sudden, dark shape of another ship appearing, growing slowly, its flags unclear, tension rising like the swell under the keel. And, years later, a silent wreck resting on the sea floor, its timbers softened by water, fish threading through the gaps where once men ran and shouted. Above all, you might hold the image of the sea itself, indifferent and patient, carrying ships of all kinds, listening without judgment to their songs and curses and last breaths. Long after the golden age of piracy ended, the ocean stayed. Tonight, it is only a background in your thoughts, a wide, slow-moving presence under the story. As your eyes grow heavier, the sounds of cannon and shouts fade first. The bright flags dim, the crowded harbors empty, their tavern doors closed, their windows dark. What is left is the rhythm of tide and wind, the soft rocking that every sailor has felt, and that you can borrow now, just for sleep. The pirates of the Caribbean are gone. Their age is over. But the stories about them still drift quietly, like pieces of old wood on a gentle swell. You can let them drift past one by one until nothing is left but the calm surface of your own breathing. Somewhere, beyond all maps, the night sea stretches on, dark and endless. For now, you do not need to cross it. You only need to rest, while the last black flag on the horizon lowers itself into the dark and disappears.